Hello, everyone, and welcome to our final day of InFocus. My name is Virginia Bryant, and I look after GitHub's customer marketing function, which means that I have the immense pleasure of speaking with our customers and sharing their stories with our developer community. Today, I am super thrilled to be joined by an impressive panel for our fireside chat. We have Tom Halpin, Distinguished Engineer, DevOps Enablement at DXP Technology. We have Tina Beamer, IT Manager, Operations and Quality at 3M. And finally, Dmitry Vinnik, Developer Advocate at Meta Open Source. I want to thank you all for taking the time to join me today. Before we start, a few housekeeping activities. We will have chat available throughout this session to share your thoughts and insights. This is, however, meant to be an interactive session. So if you have questions, I'd ask that you drop those in the QA. We'll be going through some conversation and we'll sprinkle those in throughout. So let's be really thoughtful in what we share with our amazing panelists today. And then finally, if you hear something that you want to know more about and you'd like to get a follow-up from GitHub, please do hit that request a demo button, which is going to be in the upper right-hand area. And we'll remind you of these things throughout the session in the chat. So let's get to it. Again, thank you all for joining me today. Before we dive into the general questions, Dmitry, would you kindly describe what the term Innersource really means for folks who are joining us today who may be more unfamiliar with that?
Yeah, of course. I mean, for me personally, the term was a new terminology as well. I mean, we've used the practices before for many, many years, but having the name for those practices is actually quite useful because you can find material about it. And if you were to search for Innersource, github.com has plenty of resources. And actually, that was one of the places that helped me to define it for myself personally. So the Innersource is basically using your knowledge and expertise you've built by working with large-scale open source community and open source projects, and then use those lessons learned to your enterprise, whether it's small or big enterprise. It doesn't mean making your code public and open source, but it means bringing the same tenets, of keeping open conversation, very collaborative space, trying to be as transparent as possible, having similar, governance model where you involve more stakeholders, more cross-functional stakeholders who can be decision makers. And ultimately, again, you're trying to go for a bigger participation, even on a smaller scale or kind of a closed scale of just within your enterprise, but it's the same exact approach you would take with open source. Just again, pretty close to your organization.
Thank you for that. I'd like to start off by really understanding where each of you is in your journey with Innersource, including, how you built the strategy, designed the pilots, and scaled out a program. Because, as Dmitry just sort of shared, Innersource is not a collection of tools. It is a cultural practice, and there are tools and processes that inform that. But ultimately, you're making a large cultural shift. So, Tom, perhaps we can start with you.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the tooling is important, but the tooling is basically facilitate the work, and sort of, I suppose, using the tools and sort of applying the old work practices doesn't sort of give you the best return on the investment on your investment in terms of what you've invested in the tools. So there is a cultural pivot needed, and from the point of view of a cultural pivot, the way we approached it was that we started with the executives and the management, because what we were trying to do was to move to DevOps. So we had a program internally, which we call the DevOps dojos. So we do it as a tiered level of dojos. We have a green belt dojo, which targets executives and leaders and managements as to why you would do it and what's needed from the point of view of sponsoring it. Then we had a yellow belt dojo, which was a kind of a thought process, thought set of sort of go to a class for a week and learn about DevOps. A black belt dojo, which was basically go to a class for 2 weeks, work with some coaches and bring in your problems and use the tooling to help you address them in a new way. Now, for a company as large as DXC, that's great. And what you do is you get pockets of excellence starting to emerge, but you have to scale that out. You have to try and sort of figure out, okay, it's kind of like the Golden Gate Bridge problem. You've started painting at one end. By the time you get to the other end, you have to go back and start and paint the other side of it. So what we did then was we tried to figure out how can we leverage the tooling to scale it out across the company, because in effect, you're doing Innersource as part of a cultural pivot, and you have to avoid what I call snorkeling, which is basically you do a little pocket of a cultural pivot and you have a development team that's working in Agile doing GitHub, and they're squeezing sort of a 10% improvement in a 2-week sprint, and then snorkeling back up to a 6-month-long value stream. Well, it's kind of got a BRD and formal test automation. So you have to try and sort of involve everybody in the value stream in the pivot. And that's why we looked at sort of taking dojos and putting them into our internal university and trying to get, share those with sort of, thousands of people. It took them eventually from everyone from Scrum Masters, product owners, all the way through to developers. That's how we try to manage the cultural pivot. And some places we've been very successful. In some places we need to go back and revisit, but it's never finished. It's more of it. It's kind of viewed as a journey.
Excellent, thank you, Tina. I know this is something that you've been really focused on in bringing Innersource culture through 3M. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yes, at 3M, there's been an immense explosion in digital product software development, and we introduced GitHub at 3M, and our corporate research labs were the first to adopt GitHub solely. And there was a mandate, for that group to use GitHub because it really does foster the collaborative contribution and code sharing. So they were the first ones to adopt it, and we internally use Teams channels to communicate to others and get others at 3M aware of best practices that we're following. So, that's where platform engineering teams at our company shared tower control docs. Then other divisions started picking up on what was happening, and it just kind of grew. It kind of exploded. And so, at 3M, we now have, I'd say, almost 99% of our software engineering who are developing work in spaces that code is being shared. So it really, we've seen a cultural shift. I've seen it, and some of the InFocus sessions that I've been listening to this week have really touched on some things that reinforce our best practices that I feel that 3M's already using. We have an environment of trust. We trust good intentions of our software developers. We set aside dedicated work time. Some of these things that John Peck and Glenn Wester were talking about in earlier sessions. It's really been reinforcing to see some of those best practices that we have in place today at 3M.
Yeah, that's super exciting. I'm glad to hear that that validation can be so important to make sure you're really adhering to a sound investment as well. Dmitry, did you want to add anything?
Oh yeah, of course. So I can really connect with what Tina and Tom mentioned, especially with Tom's point about the dojos or ways to really get people on the same page when it comes to organization. So, at Meta and previously at Facebook, the DNA, the open source continues to be in our DNA. That's what the open source is what we used to build the very first product. And, we continue using and relying on open source everywhere at Meta. And so to make sure that whoever joins the company, as I said, gets on the same page with all of us, gets the same knowledge and the engineering knowledge. Obviously, we have a thorough interviewing process, but after people get to join the company, we all the individual contributors, all developers, they all have to go through the bootcamp. It's a 6 weeks intense program where you don't even report to your manager, the one that you will eventually report to. You are basically learning from the ground up how Meta operates, not just open source side of things, but all the inner source work that we do, how we do it. You get to network with people who are also working here, but more importantly, that you get to learn from the engineers themselves, from management, from PMs, about all sorts of areas of the company. Because to be able to be on the same level of discussion, we don't know each other's levels when it comes to seeing the internal profiles. We don't know whether a person is more senior or less senior. We know we can talk the same language. We all have the same weight. It doesn't matter how long you've been in the company. You have opportunity to make the same changes. That's why the fact that we have what we call monorepo internally, meaning we have our entire code base on the same place in the same location for all the products. And so the code reuse, resharing is as easy as it gets. We obviously have a similar thing that the code space at GitHub is, where we able to get a particular area, a particular module of the code base and only work with that. But more importantly is this, we have all access to the same code base. We all can change it. We all assume, and we're able to assume that have the same knowledge of the code base because we all went through this 6 weeks. 6 weeks is just unheard of at a company being the onboarding program where you just learning. You get paid to learn and get to that level. So that's what I feel like the core of Innersource to be successful. Same as Tom, you have to get trained. You have to be on the same page.
Yeah, I think that's a really important call out about, everybody needs to know where these resources are and these tools are and how to work within this cultural framework in order to be successful. So, that early investment is critical. And as Tom mentioned, sort of an ongoing series of training, not expecting that you're making this investment once and people are going to take this through their career, but that you're really like facilitating a culture of lifelong learning and reinforcing these skills. So I'd love to, I guess, take that and transition because, from a tooling perspective, you do typically need to make changes to enable Innersource. It doesn't work if your code is in 20 different systems and silos because you can't collaborate when you don't have visibility, right? And so I'd love to understand a bit about what are the tooling changes that your teams made or maybe enacted just in order to facilitate Innersource to exist within your company. Tina, do you want to start us off?
Sure. Yeah, we started having teams use GitHub, the project boards for issue tracking, so that there was not a need to go to another project management tool, so things could be actually managed in one place. We also started using GitHub Actions to deploy Bicep and Azure applications directly through GitHub. So we've seen, that it has been catching on, and it's been very beneficial for our teams. Another tool that we started using at GitHub is the secret scanning. So we use vulnerability dependency reporting, Dependabot, and we're getting a lot of benefit from our security teams, using that tool. So those are just some of the things that we have found at 3M that have been beneficial of late.
Great. Tom?
Yeah, well, our tooling suite, which we call DevCloud, kind of facilitates work. So you have an agile project management tool, which we use Jira. You then have a source code repository, which we use GitHub. So obviously, as we commit code to GitHub, then we need to check that code, do our linting, our unit testing, all that kind of stuff. So you need an orchestration engine. So we use Jenkins for that. And then as you merge to master, then you want to build code, and you need to pull to sort of the binaries. You need to store them somewhere. So we're using Artifactory as the repository, the binary repository manager. And that's what we do. The workflows that we have then sort of flow across those four main tools.
Excellent. Dmitry, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, so with us, with Meta, I believe the key to success for us being, we're not really imposing any particular tool, especially internally or externally as well, the open source side of Meta, where really people can request a tool, especially for the open source. It doesn't have to be, for example, GitHub Actions. It can be some other CI platform if they wanted to. They can make a request. We would process it in a timely manner, so making sure that it's compliant. And usually, most of the big companies are make sure the pricing, everything matches what we can do. But honestly speaking, we're not really imposing. The reason why GitHub Action has been actually more and more adopted by many of our open source projects is because it's, to some extent we find it superior in certain aspects. Like we really like the security aspect of it, where we don't have to expose tokens for the open source projects, and that's been a big thing, of course. So really, it's again, going back to this initial tenets of Innersource, that we give people autonomy, we give them way to collaborate and choose the product. But as everyone else said, we really emphasize the internal tooling. Like we have a workplace, which is one of the meta products for communication. You can think of basically like a Facebook for work, right? You can have calls there, you can have chats, but again, we don't really impose you just use workplace for video calls. You can use Zoom, you can use BlueJeans, you can use whatever you like, as long as it's compliant, you're thinking about privacy and security. If it works for you, you can use it. So yeah, that's really the gist of it. But ultimately, tooling is the key, as everyone else said.
Got it. We're getting some really great questions from the audience. And again, for folks who are viewing this today, do please populate your questions in the Q&A tab. We'll bring them into our conversation today. I really look forward to making this interactive. But I'd love to ask this one. Where I work, we believe code reusability and forking are high-value aspects of Innersource. Our number one concern about implementing that at scale is about how to share code in organizations at scale without significantly increasing our security risk. How do you control and mitigate the risk it can create? If one dev can see all code and their account is hacked, or do we have a bad actor, the threat footprint can be very large. Would love to learn from your experiences. Does anyone want to jump in and kick this one off?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. I mean, we have customers whose code we store in our GitHub Enterprise Edition, and we have it in a private repository if it's not meant to be shared by the wider company. Now, by default, we prefer to have all code shared across all people that use GitHub, because it's the intellectual property of the company. We want to make that available. And I think then in terms of, I suppose from the point of view of stuff being leaked, that's where I echo what Tina said about the GitHub advanced security features, and actually having that secret scanning enabled, and as with the features that are there, you can even have your custom rules there as well. But our starting assumption is that code should be, you want to have a reason for making a repository private. You should be putting it in public. What I tend to do is, I'm generally a lazy person, and so if I have a problem, the first thing I do is, if I'm trying to find a new library, use a new library, or find a tool or something, I'll say, well, somebody must have done this before. We're a large company, so I'll go to github.dxe.com and I'll do a search. And more often than not, actually, in one case, I actually found the person that had done it before was myself, and had completely forgotten about it. But you still, that's what putting it in GitHub gives you the ability to kind of share it across the entire developer community.
Yeah, and so instead of reinventing the wheel every time, you have an opportunity to leverage the real work that people put in ahead of time, be it you or someone else.
Yes, but there is a subtlety to the question in that if you end up people forking repositories, and then sort of that becomes a source of truth for another team, you then might have two versions of that kind of, say it's a library, and maybe there's a duplication of effort going on when they could kind of contribute back into the main repository. But that's something that you'd expect people to manage themselves within the company, because again, as Dmitry was saying, people are empowered to do that.
So I guess just to follow on to that, would you encourage someone maybe to refrain from forking and try to kind of make iterative improvements to it as if it's almost like an open source project that you're maintaining as a business?
I think that's up to them, to be honest with you, because ultimately the source code's there for them to use. I mean, if they see that again, most people are probably kind of look for the shortest path. So if the shortest path is contributing back into a repository and continuing to get the development and enhancements and the bug fixes in that master repository, then they'll do that. And if they have a reason to fork it and start a new project and take all that responsibility with them, then that's a decision for them. But I'd be kind of saying to them, if they asked me, I would say stay with the main repository and try to keep on the same path, because you're going to get all that stuff done for free.
Mm-hmm. Dmitry or Tina, do either of you want to add any additional perspective there?
Yeah, as was said before, we do have lots of training tower documentation, and we send people to a lot of the GitHub docs. There's some great blogs on friendly forking. That was also discussed in one of the InFocus sessions that it was very helpful. And like I said, the GitHub advanced security features have been adopted more and more, and the Dependabot reports really do kind of bring things to light. And my team has administrators that can be reached anytime for questions and guidance and support as the software engineers need it.
Excellent.
Yeah, and from my side, again, we have two main layers, right? We have two layers of the code we operate with. One is open source, what you would see on GitHub, and one is, as I said, a monorepo. That's Mononoke and Eden, two projects that you can actually find online that we also made public, the code behind it. But it's basically Mercurial-based source control system. But ultimately, we have these two very separate. One is open source, and one is internal code. So the open source on GitHub, it's if you want to have access as an employee, and not want to, everyone actually does. When you join, you add your GitHub account, so you can actually, because again, it's part of our workflow most of the time, and so you would have to enable two-factor authentication. So that's like the must. The level of access you'll get depends, right? If it's just read, of course you're going to get it. You can get the code, whether it's private or public on GitHub. To actually delete the repo altogether, that's a select admin access, and you just control the access. You have access control there. When it comes to internal code, there are so many layers of security there, but it's still seamless because you're going to have, you can either be on the network or on VPN. You have your laptop or whatever machine that's work associated, so that goes through level of security checks and balances. You have your two-factor authentication, but ultimately what it all comes down to is it's just code. Like obviously there are layers, like the data, the data itself is kept private, very select few, and this through very complex checks would ever get access to it. But the code itself is just it's just code. That's why we make so much of our programming code public and open source, because you can go ahead, you can build your own Facebook if you wanted to. We have React for you, we have Presto for databases, we have testing frameworks, all open source. You can do it. What actually is a differentiation is how you can scale that code with the hardware, with additional like software and all the work we've done with the data, with the user base. So the code by itself, we do our best, and that's why you don't see the leaks or anything like that. But it's ultimately just code. The data is what's the key, right? It's the hardware, the scaling part. So code is just a tool. If I were to lose my hammer tomorrow, if I'm a construction worker, it's just a hammer. It's how I actually use the hammer to get the job done.
Yep, that makes a ton of sense. I like that analogy as well. How do you manage reuse versus coupling balance in the monorepo? And I think, Dmitry, I'm not sure if Tom or Tina, if you're leveraging a monorepo structure, but Dmitry, do you want to talk about this one?
How I balance the reuse versus coupling? That's a good question. I mean, basically the difference would be, you just you grab and copy paste, or you actually have one module depending on the other module. It's a balancing act for sure. But because it's a monorepo and everyone can have access to the entire code base, coupling is not such a bad thing. But it's one of the key, and that's why we are so thorough in the interview process and, as I said, bootcamp, to make sure we all understand the key principles of programming, of coding. You try to keep it as thread safe as possible, the code that you write. So even if or stateless as possible. So even if you were to copy and reuse the module, it's how you use it. The shell remains the same, but the interface, whatever you want to call it, stays the same. It's how you apply it and use it. So you basically, if you follow those best abstraction principles and the safety principles, you don't get access to the same instance from multiple modules at the same time, which makes you more exposed to race conditions and other threat unsafe concerns. So if you keep it that way, coupling is not such a bad thing. But when it comes to actually writing the code, we try to keep it as modular as possible, but still everyone has access to them in the same code base. Yeah, so I know it's a balancing act, but it's how you code it, how you prepare those modules is what's the key is. But of course, still it makes it. It's a code-based growth. It makes, for example, switching from Objective-C to Swift. Good example in the past, because we obviously had iOS code base for a long time. Obviously, a lot of Objective-C has been written. So transition to Swift is complicated. The same for Java to Kotlin for Android. But you basically cross that bridge when you do it. But the main thing is keep it abstract. Make sure you keep the best practices in place, and you can juggle that balancing act fairly well.
Got it. So, we've talked about this a bunch already, but Innersource is really as much to do with culture as it does to do with the tooling and process. Can you talk a little bit about what were the drivers for bringing in Innersource and sort of making it a cultural mandate within your organization? Was this a top-down initiative, or was it a more organic start? And how have you handled reluctance or some of those hiccups along the way? Maybe Tom, we can kick it off with you.
Oh, that's thanks. So that's a difficult one. I mean, you're always going to have different levels of enthusiasm or reluctance in an organization. So when I go back to the dojo's point, we start with an executive dojo, because ultimately you want your executives or leaders on board, because in any kind of transformation there's going to be impediments, and at some point those impediments will either get naturally resolved within a team or within a group, or they may need to go outside the group. And ultimately what you're trying to do is you're not trying to make a development team faster, you're trying to make a product get to customers faster. So that's the people that are outside the development team as well. So that's why I think looking at the entire value stream is important, because you have to sort of say you're going to pivot over, and why we have those 4 tools that I talked about. We start by working in our kind of agile management tools. That kind of involves we've got our roadmap in there. We've got our product managers, our product owners working there, creating the roadmap, and then that gets broken down into epics, and that gets broken down into stories, and then those stories hit the development team. And then the development team start working those stories and committing code to GitHub. Code starts to get checked, built, deployed, and eventually, and hitting a customer. So if you can kind of get the entire stream, then you don't reach the situations that you're talking about there in terms of reluctance. But if you have one organization on that value stream that's reluctant to pivot, then obviously that's a challenge that you try and address within the team, or, as I said, bring that back up to the the executive kind of enablement committee to try and figure out, because it may need to go there to get resolved.
Got it. Tina?
Yeah, I would say it started out as a top-down mandate, somewhat from the research and development leadership at the company, that we were really encouraging everybody to put code in shared spaces unless there was a specific reason not to. So that started taking on, and the culture shift started happening, where we were really into sharing and reuse. Like I said, then others, the word got out, and communications started flowing across the organization, and platform engineering, and now healthcare. The healthcare business group at 3M is mandating, utilizing GitHub. So it does start from management, I think, because we set the culture and we set the stage, the tone for the openness, sharing amongst one another internally, and the fostering the trust, and fostering an environment where you can set focus time to really dedicate yourself to coding and uninterrupted time, and then communicate and educate others about best practices. So hopefully that helps answer your question.
Yeah. Dmitry, do you want to share?
Yeah, we definitely were lucky with the fact that the Innersource practices or open source, as I said, has been with us from the very start. So it's from the very top level, because that's what we use to build the product, the initial product, and that's what we use for a lot of our work. So that's been great. The problem wasn't to start with the inner source principles. The key and most difficult thing is to keep it going and maintaining it and improving it, setting up processes. Because in regard to open source, like to outside of inner source, but to the open source, you have to make sure now, you put in place goal setting, you put in place processes of how to wind down the project that's open source, right? So it's not just out there, but how do you keep it maintained? If it's not maintained by you, maybe you can give it up to the foundation or work with it, become a part of the foundation, because the community, like the governance model, the product maybe naturally evolved that way. Maybe it's just research based, so you just read me. So setting up those processes, setting up CLA, so people, while working with the code that we make public, they are we all it's all accounted for. So if anything ever arises, all the licensing is in place, code of conduct are in place, so it's a safe environment. People know how to contribute. Their contributor guide is there. So those processes, maintaining and keep it growing, has been the challenge. Not really starting, because as I said, we were lacking, and I'm still very extremely happy to be part of Meta because of this thing, that the open source been in our DNA from the very start.
Great. And, we've talked a lot about like how to do Innersource, or, the foundations of Innersource and training and whatnot. But I think we would be remiss if we don't talk about why do this? What is the benefit to your developers and to the business for making an investment in an Innersource methodology? And if you think about like Tom and Tina, where a lot of this was top-down initiative, why do leaders want to drive this? What do you get out of this investment? Tom, Tina, one of you. Let's start with Tom, please.
Well, I'm going to kind of go to a story, actually, because I think this kind of illustrates the benefit of inner sourcing to me. I was at a workshop once, and I was doing a kind of a coaching sessions on GitHub to the workshop and then to the local site. So I put 15-minute slots in a calendar and asked people to come in and talk about their problems and try to give some advice. So a gentleman came in and we talked about his problem, and he left. And then the next gentleman came in and he wanted to talk about his problem, and he wanted to know about the testing framework called Cypress. So I knew nothing about Cypress. So I did what I usually do, is I go to github.dxe.com and I search for Cypress. And there was one other person that had written a project in the company using Cypress. And it was the guy that had just walked out of the room. And I was like, oh, that's amazing. And they were in the same building, had the same problem, and didn't know about each other. And so that's what open inner sourcing gives you. It allows you to, I suppose, unlock the intellectual capacity of the company. So the first gentleman had done a test program with Cypress, put it into GitHub. Second was in the same building, but could have been on the other side of the world, but was able to leverage that work. So it can kind of talk at the sort of the corporate level and the very high level, but that's a kind of just a sort of a kind of a developer to developer example of the power of inner sourcing.
That's great. I love that. Tina, how about
you?
I
would have to second what Tom said. With so many different divisions, the automotive division, the healthcare, the personal safety, abrasives. I mean, all these, it's kind of like small companies within 3M, right? And there wouldn't be a way to learn from one another necessarily unless you had a central place. So GitHub does provide that for us. And we really didn't have a lot of resistance, going back to your cultural question, a lot of resistance of adoption. It's really taken off. It's really brought a lot of I'd say improved sharing amongst one another, collective collaboration, and more productivity at the end of the day. More code, more lines of code being written, those types of things. And so that's really what I see a lot of right now.
I guess I have a follow-on question to that. But all of you work at large multinational, organizations where you're really distributed. You have offices and developers and teams everywhere. Do you find that Innersourcing, this open visibility, this ability to search your code base, through Tom's example, and find other people who have solved a similar challenge before, is that more critical now that we're moving to an even more remote, distributed approach? I mean, we've all spent a lot of time in our homes. I see you're all dialing in from your homes today over the last handful of years. Would you say that the work that you're doing would have been more difficult without Innersource in place, going into like the pandemic, for instance? And Tina, you can start on that one as well.
Yes, I've definitely seen GitHub benefit with the fact that we're globally working, and teams are handing off code at the end of one time zone to the next time zone that's waking up and starting their day. So it's been very, very efficient. I've seen a lot of improvement of late in that cycle, and I really think GitHub and our CI/CD pipeline methodologies that we're deploying are really helping with all of that and global work. And it's kind of, I think, found its niche. Now that we're all in the groove of working from home globally and knowing each other's time zones and focus time versus available meeting time. So I really have seen that kind of fall into a nice place at 3M.
Dmitry, do you want to share?
Yeah. First, before I actually address the remote and the COVID and the going forward, just to step back for a second, the main thing that we found with the Innersource that I feel like, apart from what I was mentioned already, is that it helps with talent, because when people join Meta, as I mentioned before, we have bootcamp, and majority of people who join us, and the thing that we interview for is not just technical knowledge. It's not just to be able to code, design questions, algorithm. That's all great. But the main thing, and the thing we focus on the most, is your partnership work, behavioral work, how you communicate. Because especially as you become more and more senior, the way you're able to ask questions, the way you're able to answer them, mentor others, empower others. Honestly, that's, for me personally, is what distinguishes the more senior, experienced person from more junior. Is that not how many years you've been working, but more importantly is, instead of doing it all yourself, is how you empower others. And you can't do it if everyone is in a silo. If you don't foster this environment of openness and collaboration, like with Innersource. And from what it goes from there, from the interview process, we hire these people who can communicate basically and work with others. We got the bootcamp that I mentioned before, the 6-week program. And the key there is majority of people who join, they're not pre-assigned. They're not assigned to the team. They go through like a process of choosing who to work with. It can be, 50 teams within WhatsApp or within Instagram or Facebook or infrastructure all across the testing and security. Can be whatever they'd like. There are some specialists, of course, like myself, I'm a developer advocate, it's a specialist role, but generally speaking, you join, you choose. So, and you're able to choose, and we're able to hire them because we know we all go through the same bootcamp. We have the same background, understanding of Innersource, and openness. And that's why we're able to choose and get people to join different teams. We have a great horizontal mobility. I can, that's again, going to your COVID question, COVID and being remote and continue being remote or hybrid, if anything, it really increased the burnout, if what I've seen, and the anxiety level. And so, because it's hard to control your day end like at 5 p.m., especially different time zones. And so, but because you have this horizontal mobility, everyone is open. They open to talk about their burnout and concerns. They can, I'm tired of working with this team. I can switch and work on another product entirely without leaving the company. So again, two main things: talent retention. You get people work with you longer because they have that mobility and openness. And more importantly, is for the engineers themselves. You have this, continuous learning, what people often thrive for and look for. And so that's really what I wanted to say overall about the current state and why Meta is particularly well adapted for this new world and the world before that.
Yeah, so that level of visibility really allows people to be more successful no matter where they move within the team. That's an interesting take. I wasn't aware of the sort of hiring strategy for Meta, so I think that's really interesting to allow people to kind of match their unique interests and skill sets through that foundation period. Tom, do you want to share?
Yeah, I suppose the pandemic didn't really affect how we worked, because I think it was the fact that we were already on working kind of remotely using GitHub actually allowed us to adapt to the pandemic. I like what Dmitry was saying about the pandemic has probably had people at their desks longer than they may have been before the pandemic, and a lot of us still have to kind of go back to the habits that we had pre-pandemic. But in terms of an impact, it didn't impact us at all, because we were already working in this manner before it hit. It probably helped us.
Yeah, I think that, obviously at GitHub, we also use GitHub and leverage an Innersource model. And I think that it was a much more seamless transition for us to already have the ability to use these tools and use these levels of communication. It wasn't a learning curve in a time of a lot of other disruption, which I certainly appreciated. All right, I want to go back to the questions, and it looks like, Tom, this one is for you. I'm interested in hearing more about the dojos from the perspective of getting folks like product owners, management, and non-technical folks to buy in and participate.
Yeah, this kind of goes back to GitHub is not easy. There's a certain paranoia that starts when you start using it, because I know for certainly when I started using it, like every mistake that you made is there forever. You've got every time that you've kind of put a bug into a system, or you've had something that fails, it breaks a pipeline, it's there forever. So you have to kind of get over that initial paranoia. So that's just purely for developers. So for the non-technical people, if you're trying to get them to come in and work in these tools, it's kind of important that you kind of explain the context of which you want them to contribute. You want them to look at issues, to contribute to the issues, to use what's happening in terms of issues to sort of feed out to their product roadmap, to look at sort of pull requests or to contribute to documentation. So those type of users, I suppose, are, they're never going to be a kind of a developer heavy type GitHub user, but at the same time, they have to know all the same, a large proportion of the same use cases, or be able to meet a large proportion of those use cases. So what we tried to do with the dojos was that we wrote them in a tool, and they were actually written as code, and then the code was we basically use GitHub to teach people GitHub. So in our kind of virtual dojos, we had sort of a certain amount of characters, and one of them was Paulo, the product owner, or Santosh, the Scrum Master. And then we set up various scenarios, and then we basically had somebody kind of work through the scenario, and we had a little interactive terminal session where they would kind of submit a pull request. So that was how we would, but try to do it in the context of a story, so that they could relate it back to the role that they were performing in the real world. So the idea was to try and use those characters. I think we had about 9 to 12 characters that somebody, when they took the course, then could say, "Oh, that's me." And and I work with that guy. That I'm the product owner, and I work with Dan, the developer, or Brenda from the business. And then I kind of and then try and bring them through that kind of learning journey. And as I said, the cool thing was that that was all done as code, and it had it was as soon as we committed code to it, we'd build a new version of the course and push it out, and then it was available in our internal university.
What was the response from the folks going through these programs? Did it?
Some of them liked it. Some of them liked it, and some of them didn't. I always like the reviews of the stuff that you do that people don't like it, because you get the other person say, "Oh, this is a complete and utter waste of my time," and you can say, "Oh, okay, that's interesting. Why didn't they like it?" Because the majority of people tend to like it, but somebody that has a sort of a strong dislike of something that you've done, kind of said, okay, well, I wonder what's in that. So so the majority of the feedback was positive, but the more interesting ones were the ones that weren't so positive, because that's where you kind of learn to sort of improve it going forward.
Absolutely. Here's another question from our audience. What is the percentage of your employees who have the ability to contribute to Innersource repos? And there's a follow-on question, which is, do you find scaling and managing GitHub user management, access rights licensing to be challenging? Tina, do you want to kick us off with this one?
Oh, yes. So we offer both GitHub Enterprise Server and GitHub Enterprise Cloud, and we've bought the EMU licensing that allows for both. And we utilize the AD groups for membership to both. So we allow our teams the decision to use either platform, educate them on the differences, and let them choose, where they want to use. So yeah, my support team is in charge of auditing the user counts of who has a license, and then we kind of internally recharge for that usage license. So it's on a usage basis, whether they're getting charged for that seat. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, great. Okay. Yeah, that's helpful for, I think that was around the user management. I would ask the first part of the question, which was what percentage of your employees have the ability to contribute to Innersource repos?
Yeah, anybody who would like to get a seat has to get supervisor approval, and their teams can become GitHub users at the company. So right now we have teams across the company that are in other repo systems, and some are choosing to migrate their whole team off of one into GitHub. So it's kind of the direction we're moving. And so we don't restrict who can get a license and who can get trained and who can start utilizing the tools. No restrictions, whatsoever.
Anyone in GitHub can collaborate on Innersource across the business.
Yes.
Awesome. Dmitry, do you want to share?
Yeah, I'm always skeptical, worry of being extreme and saying 100%. 100% of people can. I can't see who can't, but yeah, basically all employees can contribute and get access to the internal code base. Obviously, there are layers, right? The primary code, sure, but there's some like additional tooling around it, like login and such. That will be additional, like permission check and things of that sort. But that's the internal code base, the code that basically gets our products going. For the open source side of things, it's just a regular GitHub account, so you don't need real permission. You need to link it, and as I mentioned, make sure security checks, two-factor authentication, all those checks and balances are in place. But really, it's the entire company. The scaling question, though, it's not a concern, but there again, as I said, there are some checks and balances in place. If whatever the open source, and again, I'm talking about open source because that's what applicable. That's where GitHub comes in play for us. Licenses, we have an open source workflow for employees, which is I can say well designed because I'm part of the team. But the key there is, as I like to quote this famous economist, to make people do something, to get people do something, you have to make it easy. So making it as easy as possible. So workflow, get approval through it, and choose the license. And legal will help you if anything. You choose the license, they assign the license to the project. People who can contribute externally to the open source project, they need to sign license agreement, whether it's individual or corporate, but it's all in place. Most of it is automatic. We have automated checkups for those projects, so license is correct and it's there along with the files. So automation as much as possible for even the signs for agreements is automated. So as much as possible, have tooling for it. But yeah, it's Innersource. The idea: keep it open, give it access to everyone who needs it, as Tina mentioned.
Tom, do you have anything additional to share?
Well, technically, anybody in the company can contribute to the repository. I suppose to a repository is the answer to the first question. Just can't all do it at the same time because we have a license. We've sort of estimated the number of concurrent licenses that we need, and that's a percentage of the number of employees in the company. And then what we try to do then is we have certain scripts that run to basically reclaim licenses, because when a user account is inactive for a certain period of days, then we will suspend that account, and then that doesn't consume a license, but their content is still left there. There is, I suppose the answer to the question, there is, you have to actively manage your licenses. I mean, because nobody wants to buy a license that's bigger than their needs, and nobody needs a license for everybody in the company. So therefore, there's a sweet spot, and the more proactively you manage it, the less costs you're going to incur. So it's kind of going to take a while to kind of figure out those numbers and kind of get that balance point.
Is that a custom script that you built internally?
I believe so. I didn't write it, so I would imagine it is. But there's one thing about GitHub: the API is quite strong, so you can actually go into the system and get a lot of information about anything from a user to a commit, and use that then to call other APIs again to interact with GitHub. I think it sounds like script.
Sounds like a great opportunity for a GitHub action.
We're using Jenkins.
This question is for Dmitry. You say that every team can have their own open source tools to build applications. That applies to infrastructure as well. Can you supply, hold on, I need to open. How can you supply it in a way that teams use their own open source tools? And greetings from Chile.
Thank you. The great question. So it depends, right? We obviously have a great setup with GitHub and internal code base. Basically, we have a special tool, which is also open source, by the way, called Shipit, that lets people make changes internally to a piece of code base that's synced with the external version, external public source version. And if someone makes a pull request to that repository, we also have a way to import it. But again, that tooling is set up for GitHub, so you can't really choose a different open source platform. So there are some limitations, of course. But if you were to say there is another product out there and you were to work with our team and show why that product is beneficial, sure, we will discuss it. In terms of CI, which is probably the better example here to answer your question, it can be, I'm not going to name names, but it can be a variety of products out there that you can set up for your project, because when it's open source, it's not just Meta, right? It's the community that's involved. It can be contributors from outside, and they have, they can work with us to figure out what's the best CI to use. It can be GitHub Actions, like what many of our projects been moving to, but again, they don't have to. They can switch to another CI if they wanted to. We will help to support from, maybe financial part, maybe from open collective financial support, but we'll basically give you guidance. But even if you propose to use a tool for a repository that's managed by us, by Meta, there definitely will be checks in there. Is it a project that's approved? Is it a list of the tool? Like you can, and we constantly get those requests, add an app to GitHub, it can be some Jira setup, can be Vercel or whatever other products and apps there are. We would review it, we would approve it. So, but people have, those project owners and the community has those permissions and rights to propose. We'll work with you, and we'll work with you in a timely manner. So that's really, it's a conversation. It's an open conversation on a case-by-case basis, and that's how we've been managing it. But the tooling is, again, I'm biased, so well designed right now that most of the time people would go the walked path because they want least traction, least amount of concerns, and just make it work. Really,
that makes sense. I think we have time for one more question. If you have additional questions, by the way, that you didn't get answered, please do hit that request a demo button, and GitHub can get in touch and just share any additional feedback that we have on best practices. But I think we have a really important one, which is, what are the KPIs that you are using to measure the success of your transition to Innersource? What are the metrics that have mattered to you on your journey? And Tom, let's start with you.
Wow. I feel like I should have some metrics, but I don't. I'm sure there's people out there that may have metrics. But to me, it's kind of like, maybe it's the way we've kind of approached it, by doing these, what we call black belt dojos. ultimately the metric that I have is when I cease to be involved with a team, and when you kind of leave the team, you know, you go to a meeting and they don't have any questions for you, or they've solved the problems that you might have helped them solve. And then you realize, okay, well, I don't need to work with that team anymore. You move on to, the next one. Do we have metrics? Yeah, I mean, we do have metrics. We would have the standard ones. Like, I mean, we would be looking at how we're testing, the frequency of our deployments, the mean time to recover, all these type of things. But again, at a corporate level, I'm not quite sure. But in the individual teams, yes, would be driving those metrics. So I don't really have a good answer on that one.
That's fine. Tina?
Yeah, I would just say the user adoption rate, the growth rate that we've seen over the past several years, the word of mouth got spread across, and more people and teams have been shifting to GitHub and adopting. We can see the increased number of pull requests or, code commits. We can check those types of metrics from the administrator's perspective, but that's nothing that we really measure nor communicate. But I see it happening, so I know that we're moving in the right direction.
Dmitry?
Yeah, I'll just quickly mention a couple of things. Of course, the metric that already was set, especially with the adoption, it's on case-by-case basis, but of course, it's just some things like security concerns, obviously monetary part, right? How much money you spend on the CI, how fast, more importantly, developer experience, how fast the CIs ran, how often they broke, if you compare. And I'll actually plug, if you were to search for PyTorch Developer Podcast, they just released on April 25th the newest podcast of why and how they transitioned to GitHub Actions from the different CI platform. And they actually walk through what improved in real metrics. Check it out. Listen to it. I'll share the link later on. So.
Thank you. That would be awesome. I'd love to see that too. I'm going to squeeze one more question in, which is how do you manage CI/CD security access environments for external or contracted developers or contributors? I know permissions is something that we touched on a little bit, but would somebody like to take this one?
We've done it multiple times. It depends, especially for the research projects. We would have special GitHub repository for them. We would have those collaborators edit it while it's private. We'll always make sure we sign CLAs. We have those agreements in place, licensor in place. So, we work on a case-by-case basis, but there's never been an issue with adding them, and just GitHub supports this access control very well, at least from what I've noticed so far. Never been an issue with that.
Tom or Tina, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, we allow our contingent workforce. Sorry, Tom. Our contingent workforce. They have to have a 3M. Get onboarded with 3M access, and then they can log in and have their own PIN that's accessing the internal AWS hosted GitHub Enterprise.
Yeah, I mean, I think we would give them a contractor ID and then assume treat them as any other employee. And then the nice thing about GitHub is that whatever they do is recorded in the system. So the system supports the fact that you've got an audit trail automatically of anything they do. But as I said, we treat them as any other employee once they get that contractor ID.
Yep, exactly.
That's wonderful. Well, thank you all. This has been a really wonderful session. I'm super excited to have had the opportunity for you all to join me today. If you do have any additional questions, again, request that demo from GitHub. We're happy to have a more facilitated chat around how we recommend people approach Innersource best practices. Additionally, you can see the QR code that's now up on the screen. I'd love to hear what you thought of the session today. We're always looking for feedback so we can incrementally improve as well and bring our community more value. And finally, next up, we do have another session left as we go into our final day of GitHub InFocus, which is unlocking the key to organizational efficiency with Innersource, and that will be with John Peck and Philip Holleran, who are both Hubbers. So please do join us later today, 11 a.m. Pacific time, 2 p.m. Eastern time. And thank you again I look forward to hopefully chatting with you all again in the future, and enjoy the rest of your day.